I'm Brian Marcus and currently residing in San Diego, California.
Very good. Tell us, how did your family first emigrate to South Africa? Why did they come and what did they come for, if you recall?
Well, on my father's side, my father was actually born in Eastern Europe, and he came to South Africa when he was 12 years old, essentially fleeing the anti-Semitism and the poverty that were afflicting the Jewish communities. His father, my grandfather, came to South Africa in 1928. My father came 3 or 4 years later in 1931 or 1932. My mother's family came from Lithuania, also probably for similar reasons, that they had family that had come, 10 or 15 years before them. They immigrated from Lithuania. In 1924, 25, my mother was born in Cape Town in 26, but some of her elder siblings were born in Lithuania, and she had younger siblings that were born in Cape Town.
Okay. And can you tell us just a little bit about your young life growing up in South Africa? Anything that might be memorable that you'd like to share?
I think I grew up in Cape Town, in a suburb called Rondebosch. It was a very, I would say, a simpler time. We had a somewhat carefree childhood growing up. I think it was cycling to school on bicycles. I went to school and to shul and to university all within, a mile and a half of where I grew up. My father's business was probably 2 or 3 miles from where I grew up, and I was, I remember fondly the closeness of the Jewish community.
I was just going to ask you, what can you tell us about life in the Jewish community when you were growing up?
So, certainly it was an integral part of our identity. My family, especially with my father being an immigrant himself, he'd come as a young boy. The Judaism was very, very close to their roots, and I think that as a result, the being Jewish, he was singled out amongst the other whites as being different, and the family influences were such where it was a very central part of your identity, or my identity. Activity in Jewish youth movements was important. I didn't go to a Jewish day school, I went to a public school. But even so, attending synagogue and being active in Jewish youth movements was very central to more or less your socialization as a young person in South Africa. So I was a member till, as a pre-bar mitzvah, I probably participated in the Habonim Zionist youth movement, and then I had a part of times when I tried Beitar, which was also a very strong movement, and then in my teens I had a couple of 2 or 3 years where I took a leadership position in B'nai Akiva, which is also a Zionist religious youth movement. So, and being a student, going to university, it was important to associate with the Jewish Student Union, which had their own separate services. It was just, it was very important, yes.
What did you study at university?
I studied civil engineering.
Okay. Okay. And at what point in time did you and your family, or was it just you, decide to leave South Africa?
My wife and I were married only for a year when we left, and it was in 1977, when I was 24 years of age, that we decided to leave South Africa. We'd actually probably even when I was a student and younger than that, when in my early 20s, I couldn't say I had definitively decided to leave South Africa, but I had decided that travel abroad to widen my horizons and see what's outside of South Africa was important.
Are there any other events that you can think of that had influenced your decision to leave? Or perhaps events happening there where you lived?
Not really, other than the prevalent discussion from the time that we were very small. You know, the prevalent dinner table discussion was always fear of the future in South Africa, that there was a mentality amongst Jews that was always fearful, you know, that South Africa shouldn't be the place for Jews, that South Africa was going to be, the political uncertainty and turmoil of having an apartheid system meant that this wasn't where we should look for our future to be, because it was almost like, you know, if and when there's democracy, Jews are going to be blamed before the whites for suppressing the blacks. So, you know, we should avoid persecution and be thinking about moving elsewhere. And that was just a common theme in family discussions. The other precipitating event was that Suzanne, my wife's elder brother, immigrated to Australia just a year before we got married, so it was 2 years before we left. So we already saw, you know, the start of our our extended family starting to make moves. And I personally didn't want to go to Australia, so I thought we need to start looking at alternatives.
So along that line, how did you happen upon or decide upon the United States would be your first your choice?
I was always attracted to coming to the United States. Initially, I was attracted to coming to the United States for the potential of studying further or advancing my degree. When I saw that wasn't going to happen, Suzanne and I, decided to pack up and take a trip around the world, with the second stop being the United States. But we had started communicating with a second cousin of mine on my father's side. That extended family had sort of dispersed around the world, and we had found some family in Boston who was also a civil engineer, and I started communicating with him the year that we were planning this extended trip. And part of the communication was along the lines that I wouldn't mind getting a job to come and work, to try, experience life in the United States. And he was very encouraging. He was saying, the response was, I have a senior position with the state. I'm a qualified civil engineer. I have a lot of contacts in the business, and I can get you a job in Boston. Just come on over. So was part of the rationale for coming to the United States. Yeah.
Was anybody else in your family considering moving, and or some of your friends?
A lot of our friends were moving. We were all very young. We were in our early 20s. No one spoke about it, but it wasn't like a discussion. So where are you moving? And where, what is your plan? It was almost like, when people choose degrees, you're never told what someone's. It's like, oh, he's studying that. It's not a discussion guys have anyway. But it wasn't a discussion that we had amongst friends. But it was almost like a surprise that within 2 years of the time that we left, we found almost all of our close friends had left to different destinations around the world. Some to Israel, some to England, many to Australia, very few to America. Yeah.
What about immediate family? Were there any plans for anybody, your close relatives or anyone to leave?
About 2 years after we settled down in the United States, Suzanne's parents, my wife's parents, started to look seriously about where they might want to relocate to, and they had one son in Australia who left a year or two before us, and we'd been settled in Dallas for 2 or 3 years, and they came to consider whether America might be a destination. So, but that wasn't, the thing that motivated us. It's happened subsequently. Subsequently, my sister and her husband, my sister's a couple of years younger than me, were also planning to move, and we helped them, make contacts in Dallas, and they ended up moving to Dallas 3 years after we did. And more recently, 12 years ago, my older sister moved finally from South Africa to San Diego.
So you said you had a cousin in Boston, and yet you chose to come to Dallas. Okay, fill in the gap there. How did that happen?
That's a very long story.
It's okay. Well, you have a few minutes.
That is a long story. So, my cousin, as I said, he worked at the State Department in Massachusetts, and the big concern was how to immigrate. How do we manage to make this immigration thing happen? There are a lot of hurdles, but for most people, the biggest hurdle is having someone offer you a job who's willing to go through the immigration process on your behalf and essentially make room for you in the labor pool. My second cousin in Boston he was born and bred in America. His grandmother was my grandfather's sister, and they hadn't seen each other since 1900. So the American family was now a fairly extended family in Boston and Massachusetts area. They all thought it was great that they were getting this distant cousin, and were really willing to extend themselves in many ways, through contacts and doing research. And the encouragement was, come over, we'll work it out when you're here. That's what the immigration attorneys are telling them. When I got there, I interviewed with 1 or 2 companies, and that he'd introduced me to. He was working for the state, and it was very easy. It was like, oh yes, we'd love to have you on board. We'll do the paperwork for you. Just leave it up to us. So we met with the immigration attorney. We had the job, and we took off traveling around the United States in a camper, which was part of our worldwide travel mission. It was we're not going to get a job and just settle down. Part of our ambition was to travel the world. So we bought a camper in Boston and set out on the road thinking that everything was fine. After 3 or 4 weeks, part of the process is having to advertise the position. This company was doing all of that work behind the scenes, but the assumption is that they're going to design a job in a way in which it will be easy to pre-qualify myself as the only qualified candidate. And in 1977, the unemployment in that area was such where they were getting PhD candidates with 10 years experience applying for my job. So it was hard to say, and I basically got this call saying, it seems like it's going to be a very, very difficult road to hoe. There's this alternative or this alternative, but the bottom line is I don't think Boston is going to be the place where we'll be able to succeed in getting your labor certification in this particular climate. But go look at the Southwest. It's booming. The Sun Belt, it's booming. So we actually didn't start looking for a job at all until we reached, I think it was Texarkana or something. I don't remember. It was the first. We were traveling around, and we'd been 4 months on the road, camping and staying with friends and meeting people along the way, and just going to the national parks and enjoying the United States and thinking about our future. And thinking, well, once we hit Texas, we'll start looking for work, because everywhere we went, that was the, oh, Texas is booming. So that's what we did. We stopped in the first little town that we did and interviewed for jobs. And I think it was Texarkana, and everyone I spoke to was like, that's great, but we don't, we're a two-man firm, we don't have room for a third person, and that's all we found. They said, you really better get to Dallas. So we came to Dallas, and the first place we came to, we were in a VW pop-top camper, and we were generally on a very tight budget. We had only our meager savings to last us, who knows how long, and we were looking for we couldn't find a campsite in the city, because we needed to camp in our camper and spend a few days looking for work. So we came to the JCC. The very first day, we said, well, they're Jews, we've got to find the Jews here. They'll have a solution. So we came to the JCC and we spoke to the receptionist, who happened to be a young South African girl,
Wow.
a couple of years younger than us. And she was the receptionist, and we told her the story, and we had a meeting with the director at the time, and we told them our story. If we couldn't just park our van in the parking lot and use the facilities here, all we wanted was permission to be able to use the facilities. So we promised not to be any bother. But when we went out, and he said that's fine, we actually got permission. But when we left, we met up with her again, the receptionist, Karen, and she said, well, my parents have just moved here with my family. I've called my mom and dad, and they said, you should come and stay with us. So they had just been here 6 months. It was Sol and Ruth Lurie and their daughter Karen.
Sure.
And so we said, great. But they had just moved here themselves and extended us hospitality, and helped us, kind of encouraged us to keep looking. I mean, in a week I got 3 or 4 interviews, and after 10 days I didn't hear from any. After 12 days I'd heard from 2 or 3, but actually by about 10 days I was saying, that's it, I'm tired of looking, I'm going to drive on. But they said, no, stay a little bit longer, you'll get. Anyway, after 2 weeks I had 3 job interviews, and then I basically had to pick the one that seemed to fit the profile and was willing to work, even though it was slightly surreptitiously I didn't, reveal that I'm here to look for work for immigrating purposes. That was after the offer came in. Then I said, look, by the way, can you work with my situation? Yeah. And the employer that chose to hire me, had it explained to him by the immigration attorney, and he said, sure, this is fine. And then we went through the whole immigration process.
Sounds like it was a pretty positive experience for you, but I'm just curious, what was your first impression of Dallas, Texas?
Well, as I said, my first impression was very positive, because we had this warm, welcoming family, that welcomed us into their family, and encouraged us to stay, and felt very positively about the city, and felt positively, and this likewise with the firm that I ended up interviewing and getting a job with. The individual who was the principal in the firm seemed to be very welcoming, even though culturally I felt like we were so different. At the same time, he seemed to have a genuine interest in I don't know whether it was necessarily helping me, but he had a genuine interest in sort of like, this is the guy, I can see something here. He was 20 years my senior, I was 24 years old. He owned and run this company for 15 or 20 years, and I felt very, so besides my image of the city, I felt very sort of surprisingly well welcomed. I felt very positive about the potential for a future.
Very good. What challenges did you and your wife have besides finding work when you were getting ready to settle in here? Can you think back on any of those that might have happened?
You know, the immigration was a big challenge. I mean, the legal hurdles of immigration were a big challenge, because even though, you know, we literally came in through the back door. You know, we didn't leave South Africa with an immigration visa in hand. So for the first year and a half, until we literally went back to South Africa to get our immigration visa, it was very much touch and go. You know, so it was relative to whether we would be successful, and the bureaucracy was very unresponsive. You know, it wasn't as if you submitted your papers and they'd send you, "Thank you very much, Mr. Marcus, we've received your papers, you'll be hearing from us shortly." It would go into a black hole, and you'd never know, you know, if and when you'd hear anything, and if and when we may have to leave and not be able to return, and whether we would have invested our time here for no purpose. You know, we did a lot of creative things to extend our visa, you know, so we ended up, that is actually a long story. You know, the first year,
Yeah.
while we were illegal and sort of under the radar, and
Illegal sounds so harsh. Was Suzanne also looking for work? How did she feel about all this and fit in?
You know, the first few days it was very distressing, because the first few days of work we were, we had a few unique circumstances. You know, my employer was willing to employ me in exchange partially for offsetting rent in an apartment that he owned, which was off Gaston Avenue in what was then not a very nice part of town. And we thought it was great, because it got around a lot of issues, and we got accommodation without thinking twice. You know, but she was, you know, it was such a unique and different environment to anything that we were used to in, you know, what felt like a crime-laden area, and we felt like we were living in the ghetto. You know, it's sort of, is this what we signed up for? We didn't stay there long. I think we stayed there for 6 weeks and then ended up getting an apartment ourselves. But that was a big challenge. She wanted to work, and she wanted to participate in something other than staying at home, and she did actually end up being, it was very good and very positive in the end. But she ended up sort of volunteering. She couldn't work for money, so it was a matter of going to the old age home. What was it called?
Golden Acres.
Golden Acres.
Yes.
On
Jewish
Garland
home.
Road, right. And my office was not far from there either, and we were living right down there at the bottom of that part of town as well. So she actually volunteered. Herb Shaw, I don't know if Herb's still around. So
He's not the director anymore, but I know
yeah.
he is, sure.
So Herb and her established a long relationship as a result of her, you know, working and volunteering her time and effort for about a year, until she was able to get real work. Yeah.
What did she find for employment after that?
Her degree was in psychology, and she ended up working for a psychotherapist up in North County doing counseling, but then she ended up going to North Texas State to get a PhD. So she, you know, the first few years wasn't, you know, it was really leading up towards her further degree or her.
Did you get involved at any point in any of the congregations here, or any of the Jewish education opportunities in Dallas?
We did. I think right from the outset we associated ourselves with Tiferet Israel, met some people there. I mean, I think, so that was a big part of more, I don't know whether it's what I took from my father or I took from my family, but it was always wherever you go, you're going to find Jews, and that's where you need to be. So really right from the outset, it was like, okay, we got to find ourselves a shul, and that sort of fit our level of practice and observance. So we were at Tiferet for several years, and we moved to Shereth when our kids were born, and we were served on the board at the Solomon Schechter Day School, and that was in its formative years. And I think that was it. Oh, and then I helped Ohev Shalom get started, and I sat on the board and helped them find their shul and their house, and
Very good.
good friends.
What, can you think of any South African Jewish cultural traditions have you brought here with you that you've maintained?
Interesting.
If any.
Interesting question. Food.
Yeah, that's important. There may not be. I'm just curious if there's any specific South African Jewish, and it may be not. Maybe it could be just similar to what we have here. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or let me put the other side. The flip
yeah.
side of that is, can you think of any traditions that you're no longer doing that you did back home that you're not doing here?
Mm-hmm. Well, we used to make wine for Passover, so that we're not doing it.
Made your own?
Yeah, it was a family
Oh,
tradition.
wow.
Because we were close to the vineyards in Cape
Uh-huh.
Town, and I think, thinking back on it, I think probably one of the motivations was that there probably wasn't a big selection of kosher wine, so my father and his brothers and his father had like this little wine cellar, and each family had their own
Oh.
barrel, and all the children would get together and grandchildren and stuff the barrels and add the sugar. And it was just sweet, like, it was sweet kosher wine. It wasn't.
Have you thought about doing that
sophisticated
here? I think that'd be wonderful.
I tried making it here.
Yes.
I bought a little barrel
Oh.
and I tried making it, and that didn't work.
Oh. Don't give up.
Yeah.
You said that Israel and the idea of Zionism was very important to you growing up in South Africa. How have you continued with that here?
I would say I've tried to inculcate that to my children, I think just to the extent that we've taken a lot of family trips to Israel. We've done a lot of, I don't do anything like support the ZOA or any of those organizations. I mean, I support them financially, but it's more of a mindset of making sure that we're on Israel's side, that we're not Jews in diaspora without any links to Israel.
Tell us about your family, your own family. How many children do you have? Where are they now?
So we had 3 children. They were all born in Dallas, and 3 girls. They're 2 of them living in Los Angeles, and our youngest daughter just moved to Houston because her work took her there. But they're 27, 28, and 33 years. We left Dallas when they were 15, 10, and 11. So their memories of Dallas are generally good memories because a lot of their formative years were here, and they went to school. They all went to Solomon Schechter.
When did you leave here and where did you go? What did you do?
We left in '96 to Southern California, to San Diego specifically.
With jobs or?
It was sort of a planned or mindful move. It was an effort to get back to an environment that was close lifestyle-wise to what I was accustomed to. I think growing up in Cape Town, the environment was so much part of your identity. As much as being Jewish was, so was the ocean and the mountains. So I think without having that in Dallas, I think that was probably the biggest adjustment for my wife and I to make, was living in an inland city without the benefit of outdoor activities.
Do you still have close family in South Africa, or have most of them left by now?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, we had a very, very large extended family. My father was 1 out of 10 siblings, and my mother was 1 out of 6 siblings. And on collectively growing up, I think I had something like 30 first cousins. You know, so we had a big family. Most of them were in Cape Town. We had a few that had moved to Johannesburg, but out of those 30 first cousins, you know, most of them, or almost all of them, got married, but almost all of them left South Africa. There might be a handful left that are still living in South Africa.
Do you miss anything at all about your life in South Africa, growing up there?
I missed a lot in the first 5 years. I think I have that as my rule of thumb. It's like takes 5 years to get it out of your system, because I know there are a lot of South Africans who still say they miss things, and they miss. Look, you asked the question about Judaism and cultural Judaism and what was different versus what's here. There's a never-ending complaint from fellow South Africans, and I don't necessarily feel the same way, but there's a never-ending complaint from South Africans over the high holidays that wouldn't it be nice to have a chazan and a choir? You know, growing up in South Africa, all the major shuls made a point of sort of outperforming each other by having a better chazan and a better choir, and it's still quite important in a lot of the shuls in South Africa. When you go back there, and people will say, "Oh, I heard the choir was so lovely." As I said, personally, I've sung in choirs, and we've had a choir. We had a choir. We tried it at the shul here in Dallas when I was living here over the high holidays, and I enjoy singing. There are very few South Africans that will say that they don't enjoy it, and there are very few people who will say. I mean, it seems like so many people had it as a rite of passage growing up, as a pre-bar mitzvah of singing in their shul choir. It was like every South African father was like, "You got to sing in the choir." So I sang in the choir when I was a little kid, and I enjoy singing now. And we have a community choir in San Diego.
Good.
But I don't miss it.
All right. Have you returned there to visit back home?
I do return. My mother's still living in South Africa.
So how often do you get back?
Probably every 2 years.
Yeah. Okay. How do you feel? Describe your feelings a little bit, what it's like to go back home.
You know, I will say that it took us many years to make our first trip back home, and that was only because it took us a long time to get established here, and we had little children, and it wasn't an easy thing to get away. And I remember the first time and maybe the second time that I went back home, it just felt, it felt like home. It felt like everything was familiar. I just loved, the people are so different. The culture felt fascinating. It felt warm. I felt good to be in an environment that I had very, very fond memories of. When I go back today, it doesn't evoke the same sorts of emotions. And I think part of it is, look, I will say for myself personally, part of it is the fact that I feel like I'm living in a place that's nicer than Cape Town. So I don't miss Cape Town. I mean, Cape Town is exceptionally beautiful, but I'm very realistic about, the social problems and the crime and the things that people who have chosen to stay and live there make in terms of sacrifices versus living in America,
As a wrap-up, I just want to end with this. Why are you glad that you're here now in the United States? and specifically in California?
So we've had an opportunity in the last several years to travel a lot of the world, and I think for me it's each time I go away I have a greater appreciation for the United States. You know, I have a tremendous, I've always, you know, since establishing myself and you know, overcoming the initial sort of hurdles of immigration, which were, you know, the first 2 or 3 years and the first 5 years to really stop missing Cape Town. Since then, I've always had tremendous appreciation for the types of opportunities that are available in the United States, and I feel like I think many times you never know where your path will take you, but I feel that I could have absolutely no regrets for the path that I chose. And I don't know whether I would have, what my path would have looked like had I not come to America, but I feel strongly that it is, number one, a land of tremendous opportunity. Secondly, that the freedoms permitted here for the individual to be what they are and who they are tremendous. You know, you, as I said, in traveling the world, you really understand like the service orientation of this country, that people are geared towards, you know, respecting one another, and that it works. You know, everything works here. You don't have to worry about old class systems. You don't have to worry about, you know, whether you're going to be prejudiced for one reason or the other.
That's good.
That's it.
Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thank you.